Well, good afternoon, everyone, and National Resource Center and Foreign Language Area Studies applicants. Thank you for joining our Technical Assistance webinar. I am pleased to introduce you to the new and expanded Advanced Training and Research Division Program Officer team. We have Carolyn Collins, who oversees the world areas of East Asia and the Western Hemisphere, which includes Canada and Latin America. We also have Brian Swick, who oversees the Africa and international world areas. Tim Duval, who oversees the Middle East and Western Europe world areas. Our esteemed Senior Director, Cheryl Gibbs, who oversees the South Asia world area. Ariana Mackey, who oversees Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands. And Donna Sapatoro, who oversees Russia, East Europe, and their Eurasia world area. As we prepare for the fiscal year 2022 competitions, we are delighted to have this amazing team of program officers. Today's webinar will provide important information as you write your applications for the National Resource Centers and the Foreign Language Area Studies programs. Before we begin, I have a few announcements. First, we will increase the FLAS graduate stipend to $20,000. We want the best and the brightest to continue to apply for and accept FLAS fellowships. Therefore, we will increase the stipend. Second, we will use the department's G5 system to conduct an electronic peer review for the NRC and FLAS programs. This will require you to submit 2 applications, one for NRC and one for FLAS, should you intend to apply for both programs. Applicants who submit both an NRC and a FLAS application will simultaneously undergo appropriate world area specialist reviews. So there are no structural changes to our review panel process. But because of these other changes, you will have to submit an application via grants.gov, one for FLAS and one for NRC. However, we are not increasing the burden for you to apply. In appropriate sections, you will cut and paste your responses to those NRC selection criteria that are identical to FLAS criteria into the FLAS application. If you apply to one program, you must respond to all the selection criteria for that particular program. This afternoon, the ATRD team members will present the necessary information for complete and compliant applications. This year, our office is juggling 9 competitions, and many of our reviewers will read for several of the competitions. Therefore, in order not to compete for reviewers and to ensure that we meet internal deadlines, we must stagger our competitions. Each year or cycle, the peer review process is the most important activity that we conduct. Therefore, we select the most qualified reviewers for each competition. Before the end of the calendar year, we hope to publish guidelines in the Federal Register. We will establish a submission deadline date 60 days from the date the notice of inviting applications is published in the Federal Register. We do not intend to make any of you work throughout the holiday season. Therefore, we will open a 60-day submission window and program officers will be available throughout to answer any questions. Now more than ever, it is important that Americans be multilingual and gain expertise in world regions. The Title VI programs work collectively to contribute to providing a globally competent workforce in world areas important to our national security, economic competitiveness, and global engagement. We appreciate and value your efforts to establish, strengthen, and operate comprehensive and undergraduate centers that will be national resources that deepen understanding of all areas and regions of the world and help students achieve intermediate and advanced proficiency in critical foreign languages. We look forward to reviewing your applications. I'm now going to turn it back over to Carolyn, who is going to begin the webinar. And I apologize for the interruption of my phone.
Thank you, Sarah. And hello, everybody. It's nice to meet you via this webinar today. I'm going to start off the session by just doing a general overview and to talk about the specifics of the fiscal year 2022 competitions. We'll also discuss the National Resource Center's specific information for FLAS fellowships, information that applies to both programs. As many of you know, these programs are sort of sister programs, and they do have one application, but we're going to dive into exactly where there are slight differences in the review criteria, et cetera, to make sure that you are as prepared as possible to apply. On that note, we will also discuss application tips. We will give you our program contacts so that you know who to get in touch with if you have follow-up questions for your particular world region. And then we'll go over some questions and answers that we've received ahead of time. The ones that we'll show on the slides are questions that came in by email, but we will also have time for you to submit questions via the chat window, and we can answer those live, on this webinar. Just a quick note on that questions section, because we have so many attendees today, we may not be able to get to everyone's question, or there may be questions that are quite specific to one particular center that wouldn't necessarily be applicable to the general NRC and FLAS community. And in those cases, if we don't get to your question today, please email us afterward and we'd be happy to respond directly. So to start off with, we'll discuss what is specific about this upcoming competition. So the big number one question that everybody has is the anticipated timeline, of course. We have not received confirmation of funding for fiscal year 2022. So until that happens, we won't be able to announce the competition. When we do have the confirmed final information, the announcement will come via the Federal Register notice on IFLE's website and through IFLE's newsletter. The best way, the quickest way, I suppose, to learn about the minute the competition opens is to check the Federal Register. That is where the announcement will happen first. You can set up keyword searches and get emailed about each program so that you don't miss the minute the announcement is made. Then, of course, we'll update our websites, and you can use the links listed here to keep an eye out for new information. We are expecting the Notice Inviting Applications, or the NIA, as we call it for short, to be published in December or in January. A lot of that depends on, bureaucratic, I guess, machinations behind the scenes. So, we appreciate your patience as you all wait with bated breath for the announcement to drop. As Sarah said in the introduction, once the announcement goes out, you will have 60 days to apply. So obviously the deadline will depend on when the announcement is made. So, so that should give you a general sense of what to expect. As I said, program funding for fiscal year 2022 hasn't been confirmed just yet. So we cannot share any final information on that front. That said, our estimates are similar to the most recent fiscal years for the program. So provided, that the funding remains the same or potentially increases, the range for NRC awards would be between $180,000 and $275,000 per year for an NRC. The average NRC award during this last grant cycle was $237,000. So that should give you a general sense of how much money is reasonable to ask for with these awards. For the Foreign Language and Area Studies program, the FLAS Fellowships program, the range is a little bit broader. On the low end, we have around $88,000 per year for an institution. On the high end, we have in the $600,000 range, but that is really a consortium application where both institutions are awarding lots of awards every single year. So it's a wider range with FLAS. The average FLAS award for the last grant cycle was $294,000 per institution. What's new for fiscal year 2022? We are very pleased to share with the current NRC community and potential NRCs that we have eliminated the need for you to do the performance measure forms. That means you don't have to submit any performance measure forms in the application, and we will not be requiring them as part of the grant monitoring process for the next grant cycle. If you don't know what those are because you have not participated in this grant program before, you don't need to worry about it. But if you are a current grantee and you are worried about the PMFs, you can feel confident that you will not have to do those for this next grant cycle. As Sarah mentioned, we are also increasing the academic year graduate FLAS stipend amount. My colleagues will get into the specifics of that further along in the webinar when we discuss the FLAS program. We have also made some updates to the order of the selection criteria. My colleague Brian has dived deep into the details of that and will walk you through the order and what has changed and any and all questions about the selection criteria. And then finally, this is more of an administrative change than anything, but we have a new Western Hemisphere world area, which basically just combines the Canada and then the Latin America and Caribbean world regions into a Western Hemisphere world region to better align with other government agencies and how they define the world regions. Okay, what else is new? As Sarah mentioned, the NRC and FLAS applications will be submitted separately this year. This is a change from prior years. However, this does not mean that you'll submit two entirely different applications. We're still just asking for one narrative that covers both NRC and FLAS criteria. It'll just basically mean submitting the same application 2 times in grants.gov. One for FLAS, one for NRC. So if you're applying for both NRC and FLAS, you'll respond to the corresponding selection criteria in each application. You should use the same narrative that addresses both NRC and FLAS criteria to apply for both programs. Again, we do not want 2 separate narratives. We want one narrative that covers both NRC and FLAS, just like you've done in the past if you've applied for these programs before. You may copy and paste the same mandatory forms in grants.gov. That applies to everything except the Ed 524 standard government budget form. That form, it has categories that are specific, that are general categories for government grants. NRCs will complete the lines that apply for NRC budgets. So, personnel, other, every line on the budget except training stipends. FLAS applicants, and when you apply for, you submit your FLAS application, you'll complete only the training stipends line to reflect the FLAS fellowships requested. So that really covers it if you're applying to both NRC and FLAS. If you're only planning to apply to NRC or FLAS, then it's pretty straightforward. You only have to respond to the selection criteria for that program in your narrative. And then the forms, if you're applying to NRC, you only fill out the NRC categories in your budget. If you're applying to FLAS, you only fill out the training stipends line on that Ed 524 budget form. Again, we will get more into this further along in the webinar. As far as the competition format goes, applications will still be submitted electronically through grants.gov. They will be peer-reviewed remotely, as they were last time in our FY 2018 to 2021 competition. The panel review, each panel is done by world region and will consist of 3 specialists who have expertise in the specific world area and languages in question. Applicants who apply for both NRC and FLAS will be reviewed by the same panel at the same time, and each peer reviewer will provide scores and feedback on the strengths and weaknesses of the application following each program selection criteria. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ariana Mackey, who will discuss the National Resource Centers program. Ariana?
Hello, Carolyn. Thank you. Am I coming through clearly?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll be going through the National Resource Centers, or known as NRCs. The purpose of National Resource Centers is to establish, strengthen, and operate comprehensive and undergraduate centers that provide excellence in teaching less commonly taught languages, LCTLs, instruction in fields needed to provide full understanding of areas, regions, or countries where these LCTLs are used, research and programs of study that focus on issues of global importance, teacher training activities and professional development opportunities related to the center's world languages, area studies, or international studies focus, outreach to K through 16 at the local, regional, and national levels for K through 16 schools and institutions and the general public, and creating and maintaining linkages with overseas institutions of higher education and other organizations to enhance the center's programs and instruction. There are two types of NRCs. Comprehensive NRCs provide training at the graduate, professional, and undergraduate levels and contribute significantly to the national interest in advanced research and scholarship. Undergraduate NRCs provide training predominantly to undergraduate students, contribute significantly to the national interest through the education of students who matriculate into advanced language and area studies programs or professional school programs, and incorporate substantial international and LCTL content into baccalaureate degree programs. Currently, we are confident that there will be 2 absolute priorities and 1 competitive preference priority for the upcoming NRC competition. Note that both absolute priorities must be adequately addressed in the application in order to be considered for funding. The first absolute priority is applications that provide an explanation of how the activities funded by the grant will reflect diverse perspectives and a wide range of views and generate debate on world regions and international affairs, and a description of how the applicant will encourage government service in areas of national need, as identified by the Secretary, as well as in areas of need in the education, business, and nonprofit sectors. Absolute priority 2 are those applications that provide for teacher training activities on the language, languages, area studies, or thematic focus of the center. Those of you who have applied before will notice that these absolute priorities are the same as in the previous competition. The competitive preference priority will provide up to 5 points for applications that respond to it. The competitive preference priority proposes significant and sustained collaborative activities with 1 or more minority serving institutions or community colleges, which includes institutions on the below list. These activities must be designed to incorporate international, intercultural, or global dimensions into the curriculum of the minority serving institutions or community colleges, and to improve foreign language, area, and intercultural studies and international business instruction at the MSIs or community colleges. If an applicant institution is itself an MSI or a community college, that institution may propose intra-campus collaborative activities instead of, or in addition to, collaborative activities with other MSIs or community colleges. To identify whether an institution has met the eligibility requirements for a minority serving institution, there's a link here to the Department of Education's 2021 Eligibility Matrix spreadsheet. This comprehensive resource is the most current spreadsheet reflecting MSI eligibility status. Note that institutions with a 5 or a 6 in one of the categories, those will indicate official eligibility under a Title III or Title V program, which are designated for MSIs. I'll now turn it over to Donna, who will provide information on FLAS fellowships.
Great, thank you, Ariana. So under the Foreign Language and Area Studies program, or as we lovingly like to call it, our FLAS program, allocations of fellowships are awarded to an institution or a consortium of institutions of higher education in order to support meritorious students undergoing performance-based instruction in modern foreign languages in combination with area studies, international studies, or international aspects of professional studies. An institution does not need to receive a grant under the National Resource Center program in order to receive an allocation of FLAS fellowships. Therefore, any candidate may apply for the FLAS-only program. In order to be eligible to receive a fellowship under the FLAS Fellowships program, students have to fulfill certain eligibility criteria, and we'd like to highlight just a few here. First of all, both graduate and undergraduate students must be enrolled or accepted for an enrollment at an institution receiving an allocation of foreign language and area studies fellowships. In addition, undergraduate students must be at the intermediate or advanced level of study of a less commonly taught language. Graduate students must be engaged in pre-dissertation level study, preparation for dissertation research abroad, or dissertation writing in order to be eligible. There are two types of FLAS fellowships, which are distinguished by the duration for which they are awarded. The first type is an academic year fellowship and obviously is awarded for 1 academic year of modern foreign language study. The second type of fellowship, the summer fellowship, as its name implies, is awarded for a summer session contingent on that session providing the fellow with the equivalent of 1 academic year foreign language study. Both types of fellowships, academic year and summer fellowships, include an institutional payment which covers tuition and fees for the institution, as well as a subsistence allowance or a stipend for the students. In this table, you can see the FLAS fellowship amounts for the upcoming competition, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things in this table. First of all, I'd like you to note that the summer fellowship amounts for both graduate and undergraduate students are identical. So that's $5,000 in institutional payments and $2,500 for the summer for a student stipend. By contrast, the academic year fellowship amounts are higher for graduate students, and you can see the numbers there. I don't need to read them out loud to you, but once again, for those of you who are joining us late, I would like to point out that we were able to excuse me, to increase the stipend for the academic year fellowship for students from $15,000 in the previous grant competition cycle to $20,000 per academic year per student for the upcoming competition. For the foreign language and area studies competition, in this competition cycle, there are no absolute priorities, but there are 2 competitive preference priorities. And again, these are subject to change depending on the guidance that we get from the Secretary of Education. I'd like to talk a little bit about each of these in turn, but first I should say that responding to and meeting each of the competitive preference priorities earns an application 5 additional points in the overall scoring. Therefore, an applicant can earn an additional 10 points total for meeting both competitive preference priorities. If the application reviewers deem that the priorities are not met, then no points will accrue to the applicant. The first competitive preference priority calls for an application to propose giving preference in awarding fellowships to students who demonstrate financial need. Financial need is determined by the student's expected family contribution as established under Part F of Title IV of the Higher Education Act. and does not take into account the student's access to other aid. Competitive preference priority, the existence of academic and career advising and support for FLAS fellows is meant to ensure that the recipients successfully matriculate and complete their FLAS training. So this is just a brief overview of the National Resource Center and the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowships. And I will pass it on to my colleague who will get into more details of the competition.
Great, thank you, Donna. I'm just going to review a little information for both of the programs moving forward. Eligible applicants are a single institution of higher education or a consortium of institutions of higher education. Definitions. Area studies means the study of the aspects of a world, region, society, or societies, including study of history, culture, economy, politics, international relations, and languages. Centers are the administrative units at the institutions of higher education that have direct access to highly qualified faculty and other resources and coordinate a concentrated effort of educational activities, including training in world languages and various academic disciplines relevant to the subject, world, regions, theme, international studies. Intensive language instruction means instruction of at least 5 contact hours per week during the academic year, or the equivalent of a full academic year of language instruction during the summer. Under the Higher Education Act, there are 2 mandatory aspects that each applicant must address in their application. And however, these are not evaluated and scored by the panel review because it is not actually part of the selection criteria, but you must address it in your application. And the first is diverse perspectives, an explanation of how the activities funded by the grant will reflect diverse perspectives and a wide range of views and generate debate on world, regions, and international affairs. And areas of need, a description of how the applicant will encourage government service in areas of national need as identified by the Secretary, as well as in areas of needs in education, business, and the nonprofit sectors. And I believe I am turning it over to my colleague, Tim.
Okay. So the performance period for both NRC and FLAS is 48 months, but the funding is doled out on a yearly basis. If you get the grant, you're guaranteed the first year, and after that, it's dependent upon a continued appropriation for these programs, in addition to your performance on the grant. But it is for a total of 4 years or 48 months. This particular grant competition covers fiscal years 2022, 23, 24, and 25. The projects will start on August 15th, 2022. And they will end August 14th, 2026. I'll talk now about the various application parts for both the NRC and FLAS applications or competition. First, these applications will be submitted, as Carolyn already indicated, via grants.gov, and they'll be submitted separately. You'll be submitting one under the NRC and one under the FLAS. But again, as Carolyn pointed out, the applications are almost identical. There's really only one difference, and that's on the budget, which we'll talk about again in detail later. But these are the forms that are included as part of the NRC and FLAS applications. There are the standard forms, which is the SF424, which is where you give your basic information about your institution, about the person who will be running the grant, the principal investigator or the project director. You'll also provide a supplemental information form for the SF 424, which again is straightforward, and a budget form, which is a summary budget form that has particular categories that I'll show you that later when we talk about the budget. There are also assurances and certifications that you need to submit. There's an assurance for non-construction programs. This is basically just a list of things that you have to agree to, saying that you are eligible and that you will follow certain rules with respect to these programs. You also need to disclose any lobbying, and there are forms for that. And then there are descriptive forms, the GEPA form, the General Education and Provisions Act, Section 427. This is basically where you talk about equal opportunity, employment, and those kinds of things. You also need to disclose your diverse perspectives and the wide range of views that you will include in your funded activities. And you will talk about the ways in which that you will encourage government service in areas of national need and other employment sectors. Getting into sort of drilling down into a little more detail, you will need to develop a project abstract, which is a 2-page description of what it is that you're planning to do during the 4-year grant period. You should definitely include an acronyms list, any acronyms that you're going to use in the narrative or in the application more generally. You should put in a list up front to make it easier for reviewers. In general, actually always consider your reviewers when you're writing these applications, but we can talk about that more later. You should include a table of contents that clearly explains or lists what it is that is contained in your application. You need to obviously include a project narrative, which is the sort of basic story that you're telling about what it is that you're planning to do in the 4 years with the grant money. You should also include a detailed line item budget and budget narrative for the NRC. This won't be as important for FLAS, obviously, because these are just training stipends. There's not a lot to explain. But for the NRCs, you'll need to have a budget narrative that explains in a detailed way how it is that you plan to spend the money. Again, the reviewers rely on this to assess the strength of your budget. And then there are appendices that go along with this to help support your narrative. You can include half-page bios or CVs of the various people who will be involved in the grant. This is also very important because the reviewers do look at this to make sure that you are putting forward qualified individuals to work on this grant. You should have a description of any positions that will be a part of your center. You should include a course list and letters of support. We'll go into a little more detail about these again later. You also need to include a profile form. This is where you designate what your world area is, and you also provide a list of the FLAS eligible languages. So the ones that you want to be included as a part of your FLAS grant will be listed there under the world area that you are designating for your application. As far as the abstract is concerned, it should be 2 single-spaced pages. It should clearly articulate how your application aligns with the purpose of Title VI, and it should summarize the specific activities in the project, as well as what you anticipate will come out of the proposed project. What are your anticipated outcomes? And it should also describe the center's unique characteristics in terms of what the mission of the center is, what resources are available, including faculty, library, outreach plans, and those sorts of things, as well as internal and external constituencies. The narrative is the section that addresses the selection criteria, which Brian will talk about in detail soon. And it should include, of course, the announced priorities for the competition. Any priorities you should try to address. The 5 points can matter a lot in the end. The suggested page limit, and that's a suggested page limit, is 50 pages for a single institution narrative and 60 for a consortium narrative. Now, even though these are suggested, you can go over a little bit, but I would recommend that you be very, very careful about that, in large part because, again, you want things to be as easy as possible for your reviewers. We ask a lot of them, and they take their job very seriously. And you want to make sure that you are as clear as possible and that you're not overburdening them. So please try to stick to 50 pages for a single institution narrative and 60 for a consortium narrative. And remember that if you are applying to both NRC and FLAS, you only need to submit one narrative. Just copy and paste. But of course, make sure that your narrative addresses both the NRC and FLAS selection criteria. The reviewers will read the narrative, will read just one narrative, but they'll provide separate scores for NRC and separate scores for FLAS because the selection criteria differ a little bit. There's quite a bit of overlap between NRC and FLAS, as Brian will show, but there are some that are different, and so they'll be scored separately, but you only need to submit one narrative. And now I'll pass it on to Brian.
Brian, you're on mute.
Thank you, Tim. I just will be leading us through a tour through the NRC and FLAS selection criteria today. As Tim mentioned, the selection criteria are extremely important because they are the basis on which project narratives will be scored by the peer reviewers. And just to reiterate what has been mentioned several times already today, we're asking applicants to submit one narrative regardless of whether they're applying to the NRC program, the FLAS program, or both programs. And the peer reviewers will score based on the one narrative. However, as my presentation will make clear, as you're writing your narrative, you want to make sure that you're responding to the selection criteria that are specific to the program or programs to which you're applying. And to add one more element, this also will vary slightly depending on whether you're applying to be a comprehensive NRC or an undergraduate NRC. And just to preview that a little bit, that typically means that you'll be focusing primarily on the strength of your undergraduate programs if you're applying to be an undergraduate NRC. So broadly speaking, the selection criteria for these programs are drawn from our program regulations as codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, and they're grouped into several large categories. And under each category, as you'll see as we go through them, there are several specific review criteria that reviewers will be looking for. And broadly speaking, this is a chance to think about your narrative in two particular ways. As Tim already mentioned, it's a time to tell a story about your institution and your center and describe many of the strengths that you have. And it's also a chance to talk about the plans for the future. And so your narrative, regardless of whether you're applying to NRC, FLAS, or both, will have to attend to both of these concerns. And so let's start our deep dive into the selection criteria. The first category that we'll be looking at today is called commitment to the subject area. And for both the NRC and FLAS applications, this will be scored on a 5-point basis. This category is somewhat unique because it only has one actual specific review criteria in which you need to address all of the elements listed here as you talk about your institution's financial and other support for the operation of your center, for your teaching staff, for library resources, for overseas linkages, outreach, and students in fields related to the center's focus. And of course, if you're just applying to the FLAS program, you can easily just read applicant rather than center for all of the criteria that we're going with today. But we based our discussion on the comprehensive NRC criteria because that is the most common form of application that we receive. The next general category to consider will be the quality of language instruction at your institution. For both NRC and FLAS applications, this will be worth 14 points. And in this section of your project narrative, you should discuss the languages and levels offered through the center or other providers at your institution, student enrollments, courses and disciplines other than language, linguistics, and literature offered in appropriate foreign languages, the number of language faculty and exposure to pedagogical training, performance-based instruction in use or being developed, and resources for language teaching and practice and language proficiency requirements at your institution. And similarly, because our programs are interested both in language and area studies, the next general category of selection criteria are termed the quality of non-language instructional programs. And in many ways, this will mirror the category that we just discussed. And again, is also worth 14 points for both NRC and FLAS. And in this section of your project narrative, you should address the course offerings in a variety of disciplines, including professional schools. And of course, if you're just an undergraduate NRC applicant, you will just be discussing undergraduate programs, unless of course you're also asking for an allocation of FLAS fellowships. And this is one of those examples where you do need to be a little attentive depending on which programs you will be applying to. And in this section, you will also be addressing the depth of specialized courses available in one or more disciplines related to the center's subject area, the availability of teaching faculty and instructional assistants at your institution, pedagogical training for instructional assistants, and the extent to which interdisciplinary courses are available for students at your institution. The next category, and also one that's common to both the NRC and FLAS scoring criteria, is that of quality of curriculum design, which is worth 13 points. And in this section of your narrative, you should address the ways in which the curriculum available at your institution incorporates undergraduate instruction into baccalaureate degree programs, and the degree to which curriculum incorporates training for graduate students from a variety of disciplines and professional fields. And again, if you're just applying to be an undergraduate center, the focus will be on your undergraduate programs in most cases. This section will also ask you to explain the degree to which academic and career advising are available to your students, the degree to which research and study abroad opportunities exist at your institution, and the existence or access to summer language programs. The next category, and again, one that is common to both NRC and FLAS, is the quality of staff resources at your institution. And this is worth 13 points as a general category. In this section of your project narrative, you should address the teaching faculty and other staff and their qualifications for the current and proposed activities contained in your narrative, and the degree to which professional development activities and the degree to which these individuals participate in teaching, supervision, and the advising of students. You should also comment on the staffing and other oversight arrangements available at your institution related to the activities of the center, and you also need to address the degree to which your center practices non-discriminatory practices for employment. The next category is the strength of library, and again, this is common to both the NRC and FLAS applications, and it is worth 6 points. And generally speaking, in this section of your project narrative, you should describe the various holdings and strengths of your library, and also the access that individuals on your campus and other institutions have to those resources. The next category is impact and evaluation, and this is also common to both the NRC and FLAS selection criteria. And in this competition, it'll be worth 25 points. In this section of your narrative, you will address the significant impact on the university's community, region, and the nation, as shown through enrollments, alumni placement data, participation rates in events, and use of the center's resources. And if you're applying for an allocation of FLAS funds, you will also need to point out the contributions that your program is making to the creation of area studies and language specialists. And again, similar to the previous category, you will need to address non-discriminatory equal access to programs, and as well as offering a comprehensive, objective, and quantifiable evaluation program for your activities, and explain the use of recent evaluations to inform your current plans. However, this is a very long category, as befits its relatively high point value compared to the previous ones. So there are several other things that you will need to address as well. These include describing how activities allow you to meet national needs and generate information available to the public. You will also need to discuss your record for postgraduate employment, education or training in areas of national need, and efforts to increase those placements through your activities. You also will need to collect and share data that shows the extent to which students matriculate into advanced language programs and area or international studies programs or related professional programs if you are applying as an undergraduate NRC. In addition, if you're applying to FLAS, you will also need to describe how the awarded fellowships address national needs, and again, share information about undergraduate and graduate enrollments and placement data. This next category gets into the sections that are specific to one program and not applicable to the other. So the category of outreach activities is specific to the NRC program to both comprehensive and undergraduate NRCs. This will be worth 9 points for the NRC program. This section is not applicable for FLAS applicants. In this section, you need to address the significant and measurable regional and national impact, as well as the involvement of faculty and professional schools when performing outreach directed toward a variety of constituencies. These include elementary and secondary schools, post-secondary institutions, and broadly speaking, the business, media, and the general public. The next category is again one that's specific only to the NRC programs for both comprehensive and undergraduate NRCs. This is the category of program planning and budget. This program, like impact and evaluation, is worth 25 points for NRCs, both undergraduate and comprehensive. This section is really the meat of describing what you intend to do with the funds that you're requesting. This section especially is meant to be forward-looking and describing how you will deliver new activities that relate to the goals of the NRC program. And so as you're describing the ways in which you intend to use the requested funds, you need to be sure that you're describing activities that are high quality and directly relevant to the purpose of the NRC program. You also need to share a development plan or timeline that demonstrates how the proposed activities will contribute to a strengthened program and an effective use of resources to achieve the proposed objectives. Related to that, you also need to show that the costs that you predict are reasonable in relation to the objectives you hope to obtain, and you also need to describe the long-term impact of the project at your institution, and again, at the appropriate level that you're targeting, be that undergraduate, graduate, or professional training programs, depending on the precise kind of NRC that you hope to become. Now, this next category is the only category that's specific to the FLAS application. This is called the FLAS Awardee Selection Procedures, and it is worth 10 points for the FLAS application. If you are just applying to the FLAS program, you must respond to this. If you are just applying to an NRC program, you do not need to respond to this. And in this section, you need to discuss the high quality selection plan that describes how fellowships will be advertised, how students will apply, the selection criteria that you intend to use to select students, the composition of the selection committee that will select students for the award, the timeline for your competition, and how fellowships address the various priorities associated with the FLAS program. Now, the selection criteria, as I said, are drawn from our regulations related to these programs. When they're actually presented for reviewers to review, they'll be done in the form of the technical review form, or the TRF. The TRF, put simply, is the score sheet that's given to peer reviewers on which they will judge your project narrative. This reflects much of the language we were just used, but may be slightly different in terms of ordering or exact wording. And this is where points are assigned not just at the category level, but with various specific review criteria. Generally speaking, the TRFs provide a chance for reviewers to score your project narrative on the individual criteria that we just mentioned, and they will also be able to comment particularly on the strengths and weaknesses associated with each of the specific selection criteria that are on the TRF as drawn from our program regulations. The TRFs follow the program selection criteria, although the ordering may be slightly different. And generally speaking, the TRF is the best guide or outline for arranging your project narrative. If we're thinking in terms of what my colleague Tim mentioned earlier, you should always keep in mind that you're writing for your peer reviewers. And to the extent that which you can help them locate information that they need to find, it will be to your benefit. And so use the TRF as a guide for structuring your project narrative. Full copies of both TRFs, that is TRFs for the NRC and the FLAS programs, will be included in the application package for each of the programs. As you see here, this is 2 images taken from the TRFs for the respective programs that we've been discussing at the category level. And you can see that there is substantial overlap among the categories. In total, the NRC and FLAS programs share 7 categories of selection criteria and a total of 22 items that are substantially the same. The NRC program in total has 10 categories and 30 items on which you'll be scored, and the FLAS TRF has 9 categories and 25 specific selection criteria. And that will be the basis on which you're scored. But again, just to hammer home a key point that we've been making throughout today's presentation, as you're crafting these narratives, we only want you to craft one narrative, and as you do that, make sure that you're responding to all of the selection criteria that apply to the programs through which you hope to secure funding. Now, as we've also mentioned, there are several cases where the specific wording of selection criteria do vary across programs and between the comprehensive and undergraduate NRCs. Because we're asking you to submit 2 applications into the system with only one narrative, we just want to make sure that you're attentive, that you're responding to exactly the criteria that you need to. So in order to highlight these differences and to make your task a little easier as a writer of a narrative, we will eventually be posting a crosswalk table to demonstrate where these differences exist in the selection criteria so that you're aware of them and can plan appropriately depending on the programs to which you're applying. And you'll be able to access them eventually at the links you see here on this slide. Here's one example from the crosswalk table that we're working on. And you can see here that we're trying to locate selection criteria that differ from either the comprehensive NRC and undergraduate NRC, or more generally between the NRC and FLAS programs. And so you can see here that we've tried to extract language from the selection criteria as they appear on the technical review form and put it in the top box, and then highlight where the difference is. And so you can see with this criterion that there is a difference in wording between which students should be addressed. And so for the applicants to the comprehensive NRC program, you will need to address the extent to which interdisciplinary courses are offered for both undergraduate and graduate students. This differs slightly from the undergraduate NRC program, where you just need to address undergraduate students. And then FLAS applicants need to address the availability of interdisciplinary courses for the relevant student populations. And so this just keys you into some of the slight and subtle differences that exist in the selection criteria. And so be attentive to this, particularly if you're applying to both the NRC and FLAS programs. And with that, I would like to turn the presentation back over to Tim Duvall.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to talk about the application budget for the next few slides so that you can have an idea of what to expect. So if you're applying for both NRC and FLAS, you will need to submit 2 different Ed 524 budget forms. This is a summary budget form. I'll show an example in a subsequent slide so you can see. But one of those budgets will cover the NRC funding request only, and the other will cover the FLAS fellowships allocation request only. So for your NRC one, you'll obviously attach the NRC one, the one that has all of the various categories from the form that apply to NRC. And for FLAS, you'll have just the one category, the training stipends, that applies to FLAS. If you're applying for only NRC or only FLAS, then you only need to submit the budget that's related to that particular one. So these are the categories that are on the Ed 524 summary budget form. You can see that the red ones apply to the NRC. The gray ones you don't need to do for either one, and the blue one you do for the FLAS category. So you'll see down below number 11, training stipends. That's for your FLAS funds request. The other ones in red, personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, other, total direct costs, and indirect costs, which are capped at 8% of your request, by the way. Those all apply to NRC. So your NRC application will have a budget form that has those items that are in red filled out, and your FLAS application will have a budget form that has just line 11 filled out to indicate how many FLAS fellowships you're requesting and the amount associated with that. This is what the form looks like. As you can see, the NRC categories are in that red box. with a couple of exceptions. Contractual and construction won't be in there. Those don't apply. And the FLAS category is number 11 down there, training stipends. So when you're doing your budget, use the categories that are included in the Ed 5.2 form, summary budget form that I just showed you. Do not use budget categories or budget codes that are unique to your institution. Okay, make sure that you separate out your categories using those that are included in the Ed 524 summary budget form. You should also ensure that your budget request is consistent with as well as supports the activities that are presented in your program planning section of your narrative. You should also present all budget years. So year 1 would be 2022 to 2023, year 2, 23 to 24, 24 to 25 for year 3, and 25 to 26 for year 4. You should do that on one page because that allows the peer reviewers as well as the program officer who is overseeing the peer review to see the requested funding across the entire project period. Also, if you're applying as a consortium, please clearly label each institution or center's budget. To give some more details, do not request support for the project director. You can include support for other key personnel, but ensure that they're necessary for the success of the project. Basically, our rule of thumb is include personnel salaries or portions of personnel salaries for people who are essential for the programming to succeed. The reviewers in general like to see as much money as possible spent on programming and as little money as possible spent on administration. But obviously, it's sometimes the case that in order to properly administer a grant, the grant needs to pay for somebody who is there to ensure that programming gets carried out and gets carried out successfully. So while there isn't really a set amount as to what you should or shouldn't put on, you should always be thinking about what it takes to convince the reviewers that you will succeed at your program. One of the major thing that reviewers are doing, by the way, is assessing the risk. They want to make sure that the federal dollars, taxpayer dollars, that we send out will be spent and will be spent well and properly. When it comes to language instruction, it's often the case that there are certain languages that just, you can only teach at an adjunct level, and it's okay to pay those at 100%. You can pay on a course-by-course basis, especially for those languages that are really less commonly taught, where you really just don't have that many students. We still want to encourage that those classes be taught, that those languages be taught, and so you can put language instructor support on the budget. You should also make sure that you review your budget carefully, preferably with the budget people on your campus or the financial people on your campus, to ensure that all the costs are reasonable and appropriate for the scope that you are proposing. And you should include sufficient detail to support the line items that are requested. That's where the budget narrative comes in. You should explain clearly why you've come to that particular number and how it fits into your project. And also, you should reference the page in the narrative that supports the budget item. Right? When you're doing your budget narrative, point the readers back to the narrative so that they'll know where to look to see more detail about what it is that you're proposing. And here's an example of for a FLAS budget narrative. So you can see that the type and number of academic year and summer fellowships that are being requested there on the left side. And then for each fellowship type, you can indicate the number of students that will receive institutional payments and the assistance allowances associated with that. This is updated to show that we are now going to provide $20,000 for graduate academic year fellowship stipends, And this is just an example of what it might look like as you are structuring your FLAS budget. Be sure to include the number of students, the amount per fellow per year or for period. Sometimes it's not a year, it's a summer, and that can give you your final number. So here are just a couple of definitions. Direct costs are costs that are charged directly to the federal award, and they can be compensation of employees who work on the award, related fringe benefit costs, right, that are associated with the compensation of those employees, costs of materials and other items that are incurred for the federal award to succeed. Reasonableness. Compensation for employees engaged in work on federal awards will be considered reasonable to the extent that it is consistent with that paid for similar work in other activities of the non-federal entity. If there isn't a comparable employee position or work at the non-federal entity, reasonableness is determined by what would be paid for similar work in the labor market. The financial people on your campus, by the way, are going to know all about this. They do this all the time, as most of you probably know, if not all of you know, and they will certainly be able to provide help with this. And then there's compensation for personal services. This includes all pay for service of employees rendered during the period of performance under the federal award, including but not necessarily limited to wages and salaries. There's also publication and printing costs for electronic and print media to include distribution, promotion, general handling, and so on. Another budget definition is equipment. This is something that we typically use. You're unlikely to purchase an item or device that has an acquisition cost greater than $5,000, but that is the definition of equipment. Travel costs are expenses for transportation, lodging, subsistence, and other items that are incurred by employees who are in travel status on official business. And we already covered publication and printing costs. Now I'll talk about the appendices, forms, certifications, and so on in a little bit more detail than earlier. So there is the, for the appendices, by the way, the appendices, I saw a question earlier that asked whether or not the appendices were part of the 50-page narrative. They are not. The 50-page narrative is strictly for the explanation of your project, what it is that you're going to do, and how your project addresses all of the selection criteria. The appendices provide additional support, for example, to show the experience or background or preparedness of the personnel that will be on the grant. This is the purpose of the curricula vitae section. Position descriptions in order to show your reviewers that you've thought through exactly how your center will be structured and what the responsibilities will be of each position. Your course lists. You need to show your courses and enrollments for last year, 2020, 2021. You need to show the courses offered for this year, 2021, 2022, and the courses that you anticipate will be offered in 2022 and 2023. And then there is room for letters of support. This is for, say, maybe people at your institution, maybe a dean or a provost who wants to express to the reviewers that the institution is firmly behind this project, and perhaps even detail some of the things that the institution might do to support the project. It's not necessarily monetary, by the way. It could also be, just saying, look, we have a clear emphasis on international education at this institution. I, the provost or the dean or whomever, I support this, and we will do whatever we can to make sure this project succeeds. So letters of support can be a very important way to set the reviewers' minds at ease that you have the support of your institution to carry out the project. And then we have the standard forms, which I talked about earlier. There's the SF424, which just says, you know, what type of submission is this? You click application. What type of application? You click new. There are 3 boxes, I think: new, renewal, or something like that. But it's new. You click new. These are new. Everybody is applying for a new center, essentially, or a new FLAS grant. And then other things like the name of contact information, the competition identification number that will be in the Federal Register, the requested budget amount for the first year, and who the authorized representative is. Then there's supplemental information for the SF424. Again, self-explanatory, and the budget summary that we've already talked about in some detail. Then there are the assurances and the certifications that I talked about earlier. You know, are you actually eligible for this grant? That's the assurance for non-construction programs. Will you follow certain rules? That's all in the 424B. What, if any, are your lobbying activities? You have to disclose that. You have to for the GEPA section 427 form, you have to indicate your hiring practices and equal opportunity things. Express your emphasis on diverse perspectives and providing a wide range of views in your funded activities, and also talk about how you'll prepare students for government service. And then there's the profile form, which we talked about earlier. You need to indicate what world area you're applying for. It's extremely important. We need to know that, so do not fail to fill that out on the profile form. And also, we need to know which FLAS languages will be eligible. For those of you who are applying for FLAS fellowship, for a FLAS fellowship allocation, you need to tell us which languages are eligible. Now I'll just give a few application tips, and I'll start with reading the notice of inviting applications and the application guidelines. Read these very closely. Make sure you know what it is that we're asking, and then make sure that you answer everything that we ask. And when you're doing this, as you're thinking through your project, always keep in mind, as we've said multiple times already, your reviewers. As Brian said, you're writing for your reviewers. They're your audience. It's not us. Our job is to monitor them. Our job is to make sure that they're all following the same rules, and that each application is being assessed on its own merits. That's our job. Their job is to dig into the details of your proposal and determine whether or not they think that us giving you money will not be a huge risk. To the extent to which you can convince them that your project is worthy and that you have the structure in place to carry it out, will say a lot about how successful you will be. Be sure to address all the selection criteria. And as much as you can, follow the sequence that's listed in the application guidelines and in the technical review form. The idea here, again, is to facilitate ease of reading. You want this to be as easy as possible for your reviewers. You want everything to be as clear as possible, and you want everything to be supported, and you want them to know where to find support. So make sure you're directing them where they need to go, so that they can, as easily as possible, assess your application. The narrative is the place where you tell your story. It's where you develop any themes. If you have a theme for your center, it's not required, but some applicants like to have a theme that focuses on some particular thing, maybe national security or something like that. And if so, make sure that you express that as clearly as possible. It's just like writing an essay from your school days. Make sure that you are as clear as possible and that you support what it is that you are proposing. Make sure you develop a budget that aligns with the project that you're proposing, and cross-reference your budget with narrative page numbers. again, to facilitate review. Make sure any tables or graphs that you use are used effectively. Make sure it's clear what it is you're trying to show. Make sure you include a list of acronyms. Make sure you include an index for the curriculum vitae and for the course list, just to show how the information is organized. Again, all of this is to make it easier for the reviewers, and also to make it easier for your reviewers proofread your proposal multiple times before you submit it. Again, the easier you can make it for the reviewer, the easier it's going to be. And I think that's it for me. I think we're turning it over to Carolyn now.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, so we are going to go over the program contacts as well as some questions and answers. And we've been getting some questions along the way. We will do our best to answer as many of them as we can today. But again, there are a lot of you on the session. We may not be able to answer every individual question, but we are available over email. So if we don't get to your question today, especially if it's very specific to your center or your world region, we would be happy to assist if you just shoot us a message after today's presentation. So here is a list of the program contacts. This is organized by world region. So please, as I said, if you have a question that is not answered today, you can reach out to the appropriate person. Some of us are just with one world area. Some of us have multiple world areas or topics that we work on. So, so you know how to use a table, and please reach out to the email address listed. And note that Tim's email address is Timothy Duval, not Tim Duval. So I've been tripped up on that one before. Okay, so questions and answers. These are the questions that we received by email ahead of the webinar today. And we will have time at the end to go over, any questions that come in via the chat. But hopefully at least some of your questions will be answered right now. So our first question is, what is the anticipated timeline for the application process? This is the big question. We are expecting and hoping to publish the NIA, the Notice Inviting Applications, in December or in January. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, whether it's December or January depends on some factors that are beyond our immediate control. So we're doing our best to get this, published as soon as we can. We are aware that it's over, that the application window will fall over the holidays, most likely. So, so we understand that puts stress on you all, but hopefully with the 60-day application period, that will build in a little bit of cushion so you can, take some time to enjoy the holidays and then get back to working on your NRC and FLAS application. We'll only know the specific dates much closer to when it actually gets published. These things happen really quickly when they do happen. So it'll probably be just a matter of days between when we find out on our end that we're ready to go and when we actually release the NIA. So please just keep an eye out on the Federal Register and on our websites. And as I mentioned earlier, you can a really good way to keep up to date is to subscribe to our newsletter. That link, I believe it's tinyurl.com/IFLE news or IFLE newsletter. I think they both work, but those are the two links where you can get your email address added to our listserv and make sure you receive all public communications about our programs. Okay, the next question is, will the absolute and competitive priorities remain the same as last cycle? Not necessarily. We've shared with you today what we believe the priorities will be. That said, until the NIA goes out, they're not confirmed. So there is a slight chance that things could be modified or adjusted, but we are pretty confident that the priorities will be what we shared earlier in the presentation. So for NRC, that would be 2 absolute priorities and 1 competitive preference priority. The absolute priorities were the diverse perspectives and areas of government service, and then applications that provide teacher training activities. So the first absolute is diverse perspectives and government service, areas of national need. Second absolute priority, teacher training activities. Then the only NRC competitive preference priority is the one about collaborations with minority serving institutions and or community colleges. For FLAS, we have 2 competitive preference priorities. Those are the first one focusing on fellowships for students who demonstrate financial need, and the second competitive preference priority being for academic and career advising for FLAS fellows. We will be posting this slide deck on our website after today's presentation, so you can go back and read in detail what our guidance is regarding all of this at your leisure after this is done today. So it may take a few days for that to post because of the Veterans Day holiday tomorrow, but by early next week we should have the slide deck posted on our website, as well as the recording of today's session posted on our IFLE YouTube channel. So yes, for the priorities, we do, there are a couple minor adjustments, and those will be confirmed with the notice inviting applications. In the meantime, there's always work to do that's, separate from the priorities. So you can start, today, many of you have already started gathering materials like your instructor CVs, your course lists, all of the other supporting materials that you need to submit with an application. So you can certainly start working on those, knowing that that guidance remains the same as it was for last application cycle. Our next question is whether the FLAS award allocations will remain the same or be increased. As we discussed, there is one adjustment, and that is an increase in the academic year graduate stipend amount. So, for this grant cycle, that means that a graduate award would be up to $18,000 for tuition and fees and $20,000 for a graduate stipend. Everything else remains the same. So you should factor that in for your FLAS budgets. Okay, our next few slides are about how the pandemic has influenced these programs and the competition. And these are obviously very valid questions, but they're also new questions since we're all kind of in the same boat with adjusting to COVID and how that has affected the programs. So how do we take into consideration the pandemic in terms of data presented in the proposal? The context for this question is that typically, the data collected for leveraging of funding and for course enrollment numbers are for the year prior to the competition. Obviously, last year was highly unusual on almost every front for everyone. And so the data that would come from last year is not necessarily the best indication of your center's capacity or your course enrollments, et cetera. A related question is, to what extent should NRC and FLAS applications discuss the effects of the pandemic on programming? So in terms of, virtual and hybrid programming that has come to be such an integral part of many centers' work. So, so do you include that? Do you talk about COVID in your proposal? So our answer to these questions is that you should modify and adjust your application, especially the narrative, and then of course the data that you present as necessary to factor in the pandemic environment, while still making your case for why your application merits funding. So it's totally reasonable to talk about COVID and how it has affected your center and your data numbers from 2020 to 2021. And of course, it's also reasonable to provide the additional information that you think reviewers might need to fully understand the capacities of your center and the strengths of your application. It's fine to mention in your narrative the ways in which your center pivoted to still provide quality programming during the pandemic. And basically, you know, like with everything, use your common sense to address the questions. Think about if you were a reviewer and you were coming at this application, what additional kind of data or, you know, reassurances would you like to see as a reviewer to feel like, okay, this center or, you know, this institution is ready to have an NRC grant or a FLAS grant, has the capacity and the strength and the expertise to do the work of an NRC at the national level, regardless of whether, you know, whether COVID continues or, you know, or other things disrupt a center's performance, you know, or I guess ability to work going forward. Remember, everyone is in the same boat here. Every single applicant is handling this question. So just do your best to present the information that will be the most relevant. Do it in a way that is clear, concise, and again, try to position yourself in the mindset of a reviewer to think about what would you want to see as sort of a reassurance of how the pandemic has affected the center. We also received a question about proposing a conference that was canceled during last grant cycle. This is an existing grantee who had a conference scheduled that, of course, was canceled or postponed due to COVID. For that particular question, it would be more appropriate to get a no-cost extension on the last grant in order to complete the activities of the 2018 grant cycle, rather than propose it as a new activity in the next grant cycle. So that's a little bit more in the nitty-gritty for current grantees, but still a question that I'm sure a number of you have had. Okay, our next question, is should applicants factor in COVID disruptions to planning for the next grant cycle? So should you, should you plan for all virtual or, virtual and hybrid programming going forward? Because now we've had a pandemic and that's maybe what you're doing a lot of now. Or do you proceed as if COVID never happened and you're just going to plan a bunch of in-person activities again? Basically, again, it's reasonable to acknowledge the pandemic, recognize that there have been changes to normal activities across campuses, and to describe how you've responded to the pandemic in order to continue the work of your center. It's absolutely fine to propose quote unquote normal activities, so in-person activities or travel in your programming and your budgets. Obviously, none of us knows what the next 4 years will bring and what it will look like, how long certain travel will be restricted. We're already opening up travel to a number of countries. The landscape changes constantly. And so we just can't predict what it will look like for the next 4 years. So go ahead and propose those in-person activities if they make sense for your center. Go ahead and propose virtual or hybrid programming if that makes sense. And if that's sort of an added value that you've come to recognize during the pandemic. Basically just again, use your common sense. And do your best with writing and planning all of this out in your budgets and narratives. And just a tip, it's not only COVID and pandemics that affect the work of our national resource centers or the ability for FLAS fellows to travel abroad and use their fellowships abroad. you know, there are natural disasters, geopolitical issues, and lots of other things that may disrupt the actual, you know, rollout of what was planned in a proposal. We know that, we see that all the time, and we are always ready to work with our grantees to modify activities as necessary to respond to changes in the current environment. So I hope that gives you a little bit more reassurance on the COVID front in terms of how that will impact your grant applications. The next question is, should you include travel costs to attend a Title VI project directors meeting in your budget? In the past, we have been able to organize in-person project directors meetings for all of our Title VI grantees, and not only project directors, but supporting staff as well. And we were hoping to do that this past grant cycle, but weren't able to make that happen for a number of reasons. For this next grant cycle, we are hoping to do an in-person meeting again so that we can meet you all and that you all can meet each other to network and create that community of NRC and FLAS grantees. We don't have timing yet, so we are hoping, we're looking toward doing it maybe later in year 1 or in year 2 of the fiscal year 2022 to 2025 grant cycle. You can build those travel costs into your budget, you know, reasonable travel costs for attending a Title VI meeting in DC. And if for whatever reason we were not able to organize one, then you would be able to reallocate that money toward another activity in your budgets. But go ahead and include it now if you'd like, and hopefully we'll be able to see many of you in person sooner rather than later. Okay, our next question, let me pull it up here, is how do transnational and transient population issues and populations fit into area studies framework? The particular question we received is related to Asian studies. So for example, Chinese investments in Africa, the Japanese diaspora in Latin America, the phenomenon of global K-pop music, and is there guidance on treating those kind of issues as part of an NRC proposal? You may include these activities and these issues in your proposal as long as they make sense for your center. If the subject matter aligns with the work of your center, and you know it aligns with the mission of the NRC in terms of public outreach or developing expertise on certain issues, it's no problem to include topics that expand beyond the technical borders of the region in question. So for instance, you could talk about Chinese investments in Africa. That would make sense if you're an Asian studies in East Asia or Pan-Asia center. That might make sense if you're an Africa center. That might make sense if you're an international center. That wouldn't be as clear, for a Latin America center to propose. However, if there was some link there that wouldn't be visible on the surface, but could be explained, again, it's just about making sense with the alignment of your center and what you do. The next question is, are FLAS and NRC cost sharing programs? And the answer is no. You do not have to propose cost sharing. You can if you want. But just FYI, if you include that in your grant proposal, then you'll be held to that on the back end in terms of G5. That's our financial management system reporting. So you don't have to, but you can. The idea of institutional commitment is also something that's not exactly the same as cost sharing. You can do institutional commitment and get commitments from your college or your dean or other funding sources to sort of work in tandem with your NRC or FLAS funding. And that wouldn't necessarily have to be defined as cost sharing. You could just say that's part of your institutional support. And that way you wouldn't be held, I think, held to it in G5, as an official cost share. but that would be something that would, maybe speak to the strength of an application and your center if you were to show some of that institutional commitment and funding from your administration. Okay, the next question is about the maximum number of letters of support that may be included. There is no maximum number of letters of support that you can include, but the application package for these programs recommends limiting the number to 5. You do, again, as Tim mentioned, you want to always keep in mind your reviewers. You don't want to annoy them. That's a bad position to put yourselves in. So, to whatever extent possible, try to keep it in check. You don't need 20 letters of support. It's if you get 5 really good ones, real quality ones that make sense in the scope of your application. So we recommend 5, but it really is your choice as to if you want to exceed that or not. Same goes for the page limits. There is it's not a formal limit. You won't be, your application won't be thrown out if you exceed the 50 or 60 pages, whether you're an individual or consortium that is applying. But again, keep in mind that the readers are reading hundreds of pages. Each application is usually like between 100 and 300 pages, and each panel reviewer might have to read 10 applications. So that's a lot of reading. These reviewers are only human, and so you don't want to make their job difficult. So it really is, it's really your call as to how much, the risk-benefit analysis there of, is it worth adding on pages for a potential return in terms of your technical review form. The same goes for formatting. We do have formatting guidelines that will be included in the application package. That's the Word document that will go on the website and that will be included in the grants.gov application package. So go there, look at the formatting guidelines. They are guidelines, not requirements. And then we leave it in your hands to decide how you want to proceed. Yeah, the next question is about changes to the format of bios or course lists. There are no changes on that front. So the guidance that was in the last cycle's application package will be the same as for this cycle's application package. So you can refer to that for more information. The final formal question we have is that for position descriptions, what type of staff and faculty should you include? This is a judgment call. If a position is directly involved in the day-to-day operation of a center and the administration of the grant itself, then you should include it. It makes sense for an outreach coordinator, for that position description to be included because they are working on directly every day to achieve the mission of the NRC. A language instructor, even if they're funded 100% out of NRC funding, we don't need to see a position description for that. First of all, it's pretty obvious what a language instructor does. Second of all, they aren't working day to day on the actual administration of the grant. They are, associated with achieving the goals of the grant, but through a particular activity. So it's a judgment call. Do your best to figure out, again, would a reviewer want to see this description? A project director, yes, that makes sense. Associate director, obviously. Outreach coordinator or FLAS coordinator, that obviously makes sense. Outside of that, if you have other people working on the grant, think about how much are they working on the grant? and does it make sense? It's not really a question of salary support here. It's a question of the work that the person is doing day in and day out. So that is our final formal question and answer. If you have other questions, now is the time to submit them in the chat box. I will pull up, I'll pull up the videos for my other colleagues so that we can all be on to answer additional questions that come in. So we'll go to that now.
Here's one question. Should position descriptions be included only for staff and faculty who have not yet been identified or hired and will have their salaries at least partially supported by the grant, or existing positions as well? That's kind of a judgment call, but in general, I would think that you should have position descriptions for the people who are directly involved in the grant, whether they're being funded by the grant or not. That's just to again, show your reviewers that you have a clear plan in place with positions in place to carry out the tasks that you propose in your grant application.
We have a question about including timelines with NRC applications. That is a fine thing to include in the appendices. I do think some reviewers like to see a timeline. So you can go ahead and include that and just break it out in your table of contents. As far as guidance for new applicants goes, or typical rookie mistakes, that's a hard question to answer directly, but I'll share with you the guidance that I always give to my grantees and my potential applicants. First things first, read the notice inviting applications and read the application package Word document itself. Again, that will be added to our applicant info website for both the NRC and FLAS programs when it's available. Order your narratives in the order of the technical review form criteria, or that the criteria are listed on the technical review form. Reviewers really like it when they can just go through the form as they're reading and they don't have to jump around. Reviewers also like it when a budget is cross-referenced. So those are really simple things you can do to make the reader's experience easier, which always helps. The other thing I would say is make sure with those selection criteria, really read them closely and pay attention. Sometimes a reviewer will say, well, they're generally answering this, but they didn't answer that specific, one line out of the 5 things that are mentioned here. So I think we have to take off a point. Just be detail oriented, really read it carefully, and go through, Brian has developed this crosswalk document that we are going to post on our websites next to the application package, and you really use that to make sure you are maximizing your points on each particular criterion. Finally, the thing I would add would be to take a look at successful applications from current centers. Those are all posted on our IRIS project monitoring website. I'll drop a link in the chat right now. But if you go to iris.ed.gov and scroll down under Browse Title VI, there's a link for funded applications. That has all of the applications that were successful last time. That's a great place to start to see how other institutions have done it, and how they've formatted budgets, how they have described projects in their narratives. So you don't have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. That's kind of a good place. And then the other thing I want to mention before I end is that if you have applied in the past, definitely look at the technical review forms that have come back to you last time. If you did not receive the grant last time, go back to that TRF and see where points were deducted and make sure that you're answering those questions this time around. yeah, Brian dropped the link to the funded applications in the chat.
There have also been a number of questions about the evaluation plan. I just put something in the chat there that gives a sort of basic approach, but I'll just read it real quick because it might have already gone out of the screen. So, does the evaluation plan describe a methodology for establishing a baseline and tracking the project's progress during the project? Do evaluation techniques use quantitative, such as hard data or statistics, and qualitative, such as interviews, surveys, observations, data as appropriate to measure and report results? Will the center use an evaluator to assess the success of the project, and will that evaluator be unbiased? Basically, you should develop a plan for evaluating the work of the center over the course of the 4-year grant period, and you should clearly transmit that plan, the plan of that in that section of your application.
We've received a couple of questions regarding languages, and I just wanted to make sure that that information is clear for everybody. These programs do have a particular interest in less commonly taught languages. So that's any language that is not French, Spanish, or German. French, Spanish, and German are allowed to be included in the activities of these programs, but really the emphasis is more on the less commonly taught languages. So particularly with FLAS awards, the large majority of FLAS awards do go for less commonly taught languages. So so I hope that helps clarify. You can do the commonly taught ones as part of your NRC activities, or occasionally we see a FLAS award given for one of those languages if there's a really strong case. But generally we want the Title VI funds to be supporting, you know, less commonly taught languages, because that's really where the need is.
There have also been a number of questions about the diverse perspectives. One person asked whether or not it's just a reaction to politicians' critique of some Middle Eastern studies programs recently. The answer to that is no. This has been around for a while, but what exactly it means is making sure that as many views as possible about any particular topic are presented or addressed. This is what academics do anyway. I was an academic for many years, and many of us on this team were. And so we know that this is just standard practice, but it's been put into writing, and it was done quite some time ago, actually, as a response to some sort of general concerns about whether or not certain world areas were providing enough diverse perspectives. So basically, just approach it the way an academic would approach it. That is, treat all relevant sides, sides that are actually serious, and you know, include them, address them. That's really what this is looking for.
We've also had a couple of questions about the appropriateness of including certain languages in certain regional proposals. For example, could an East Asia center include some languages outside of languages spoken in China, Korea, Japan? East Asia and Pan-Asia proposals are usually, for just the number of reviewers and numbers of applications that we receive, are usually put into the same pool and reviewed, you know, reviewed together. So we may have a certain panel that is focused on just the Pan-Asia applications, while others do just more of the specific East Asia applications. But basically, it makes sense. You need to do what makes sense for your proposal. The person asking the question, I'm not sure if the center is specifically for East Asia or if it's more of a general Pan-Asia center. If it's Pan-Asia, then yes, it's okay to include, you know, Hindi or Vietnamese or other languages that are, I guess, beyond the borders of what is traditionally considered East Asia. But if your center is an East Asia center, and your whole narrative is about teaching about what is traditionally East Asia, it may not make sense to include those additional languages. So again, it needs to be what makes sense for your center. On a similar note, we had a question come in regarding the new Western Hemisphere World Region designation, and whether that means that Latin America and or Canada centers can now include Indigenous languages of North America in their proposals. The answer is nothing really changes there. A Latin America and Caribbean center can still include Indigenous languages that apply to North America, as long as the focus is on Latin America and not domestic, like in the United States. So the focus of the Title VI programs is really international. It's supposed to be beyond the United States. So if you're talking about, a language that is indigenous to Mexico and also has some population in the US that speaks it, that's okay because it's indigenous to Mexico. If you're talking about a language that is only indigenous to the United States, that is not currently supported by the Title VI programs. Same with Canada. If it's a Canadian Indigenous language like Inuktitut that is also, used in Alaska, that's okay because it's a Canadian language. But if it's just Indigenous to the United States, that doesn't qualify, I think, for the National Resource Center and FLAS funding as it's currently written. And there are discussions outside happening in that space, but right now they need to be languages that are used in countries other than the United States.
Another question, do reviewers see or have access to the statements on diverse perspectives and areas of national need? The answer is yes. The reviewers, everything that you submit will be packaged up into one application and the reviewers will be able to see all of it.
Carolyn, excuse me, team, this is Cheryl Gibbs, and I'm off camera, not intentionally, it's just that my camera is not working. But I wanted to add to what Tim is saying about the diverse perspectives and give you some context for that. Although there was, I know out in the field, there seems to be this notion that this is something that was just related to the past grant cycle. But this requirement has been in place since 2008, 13 years ago, when the Higher Education Act had these amendments added onto it. One of them was this diverse perspectives and promoting, having activities that promote debate on certain world regions and understanding areas of national need. And that was because the Congress was nudging this program because the purpose of the program is to give students and prepare scholars that have a full understanding. You always have to go back to the purpose of the program, which is to prepare people to have a full understanding of regions and countries. And so in order to get at that, the Congress thought it was appropriate that these centers provide training that allow people to think critically on both sides of the issue. So in order to do that, they said, be sure that you are presenting and preparing students to think about both sides of an issue, not just one side. So in your programming and in your curriculum, in your courses, that's all they're asking you to do is to say, and the mission of this center, and it's not only the center, these centers touch the institution, at least they're supposed to. And so in your efforts to do that, you should be very intentional about providing both sides of the issue, helping people to think critically across all kinds of issues, and to get them to be able to debate both sides of an issue. So keep that in mind. And yes, the readers do see it. Again, the team explained that it's not evaluated, but it is just mainly a response to what the Congress asked of us 13 years ago. It was not just as a result of the crisis, as I put it, the crisis in response to the Middle East situation 3 or 4 years ago. So as you develop your application, just think about, we're doing this, and I know you're doing it already, so it's just a matter of putting it down on paper that this is exactly what we do. And when students leave our centers and leave our training, they're able to think critically on both sides of an issue, both sides of a regional topic, both sides of a political topic. So I would not approach this with angst, but approach it with the creativity and the intellect that you already do at your centers. And while I have the floor, I wanted to mention something about the timing of the NIA. Sarah and Carolyn, the whole team have mentioned that we don't have control over the timing because the NIA is essentially policy statements for these programs. And so when the NIA is put together, once it leaves IFLE, it goes to several other offices in the department so they can see what kind of policy statements are we reflecting in the absolute priorities or the competitive preference priorities. How are these statements aligning with Secretary Cardona's agenda? How is it aligning with the department's agenda? So it takes a while for these various offices to review it and say, yes, IFLE is right on target. It aligns with the mission of the department. It aligns with Secretary Cardona's agenda. It aligns with other agenda in the department as far as training and including other institutions like minority serving institutions, equity issues, diversity issues. So all of these things come into play when it leaves Sarah's office and comes to mine and we send it out for a review. It takes a while for them to review it. But once they review it and give it their blessing, and then it goes over to we get a date for the Federal Register for it to publish. It's that window that's very short. It can go over, get cleared on a Monday. The notice can be published on a Friday, but it's that advance work that takes the time and deliberation for other people to weigh in on the notice. So that's why they cannot, or we cannot give you a real definitive timeline when the notice will be published. And one more thing before I leave, an application narrative does not mean everything has to be in narrative. When you're telling a story about yourself or your institution, sometimes it's good to have a visual that's put into the narrative. So rather than using words to describe every outreach activity that you conducted, you can have a nice visual to say, we conducted X number of things for K-12 outreach. We did this number of things for post-secondary outreach or business media and general public. I'm just using that particular criterion as an example to say that a lot of things are better captured in a visual that will free up space for you to use narrative to explain some other aspects of your project. So when you look at the applications that are posted online that we funded for the 2018 cycle, you will see some institution. You will see which institutions that used a very good balance between visuals and actual narration, but it's all part of the project narrative. So there's a skill and art to doing that. So when you read these applications, pay particular attention to which institutions did that most effectively.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm going to dive back into a couple of the other questions that came in. So we had a question regarding institutions that are maybe applying for multiple centers, and striking a balance between maybe teaming up on certain projects and resources, while also keeping the center able to conduct projects if not everyone gets funded. And I'll say that applies to that applies to institutions that have a number of centers, but that also applies to applicants who are proposing to work with other institutions. Frequently, you know, our area studies centers are very collaborative, and maybe 3 or 4 centers will all want to chip in funding to, you know, support a certain conference or project. And so what happens if you propose that in all of your proposals, and let's say only 2 out of 4 institutions get funded? In those cases, it's absolutely fine to propose that. You don't know how the chips are going to fall and who's going to actually get funded after the panel review takes place. When you find out, when we notify everybody of who is, you know, being forwarded on to receive funding, then you can have those discussions to make adjustments to your budget. This is a process. The budget that you submit as part of your application is not going to be your final budget. The budget you submit as part of your application is what the reviewers consider. It's what you are proposing to do. Then rubber meets the road, the reviewers score it, we take the highest scoring applications, then we look at how much funding we have. You know, we do our best to go down the list, fund as many centers as we can, you know, with quality applications. And then we reach out and we work individually with the centers on budget negotiations. So we'll say, you asked for this much, we can offer you this much money. Please send me a budget revision reflecting the new amount. And that's the moment at which you can make a change. So if the project is no longer feasible in the same way that you had wanted it to be, like let's say, you know, only 1 out of the 4 collaborating centers gets funding, then that's the decision at that point. Does that center continue the project at a reduced level? Does it find funding somewhere else? You know, does it rethink how it's going to fund? So those sort of questions happen later on in the process. At this point, propose what you would like to propose. And the reviewers will take that into consideration. Then keep your fingers crossed that all of the partners get the funding to do the activity. We also got a question about recommendations for institutions that are located in very high cost of living areas. And this is an issue that we see every grant cycle. Obviously, some areas of the country are much more expensive to live in than others, and therefore salary amounts are different. There is no clear answer on how to handle this. I think the answer is be smart. Think about, if you're a reviewer and reading a proposal, does it make sense? You know, let's say you're proposing to pay for 100% of someone's salary at a high rate because you live in a high cost area. The reviewers will understand that you live in a high cost area, but that doesn't mean that's a good use of funding. The reviewers may have questions. They may say, well, could this center have, you know, could this center maybe have done 50% NRC funding and 50% institutional funding for that person's salary? Could they have found another way, you know, to support that work? It's all about, is this a good use of taxpayer money? Is it a reasonable use of taxpayer money? So it's your call. It's your call about what you want to propose. If you are in a high cost area, that is a difficult decision. Generally, you know, our advice is always to try to minimize putting people's salaries on the grant as much as possible. Try to use the funding for activities, you know, whenever you can. We know that's not always possible. But generally speaking, it's better to put salary costs on an institutional, you know, being paid for by the institution or another source of funding to free up the taxpayer NRC dollars to actually support activities. But, you know, but it's a judgment call, and it's difficult.
There's another question that says, should the narrative generally refer to activities over the past 4 years, since that's the NRC cycle, even if your institution isn't a current grantee? In general, your application should be forward-looking, not backward-looking, whether you're a current grantee or not. You could use programs that you've done in the past, perhaps as examples, but your focus should be on what you are seeking funding for. So you should be looking forward 4 years, not back 4 years.
Yeah, we always encourage, especially returning centers, to not rest too much on your laurels. This is not a competition to decide who was the best grantee over the last 4 years. It's a competition to determine who is going to be a good grantee for the next 4 years. You can obviously use what you've accomplished over the last 4 years to justify and build your case and lay the foundation. But don't look backward, the whole time. It's really about what you're proposing to do. So keep that focus, looking to the future.
She clarified that that it's about expertise. That's sort of separate from the last 4 years. It seems to me you should certainly explain your expertise and your institution's capacity, of course. But that shouldn't need to be connected to the past 4 years. It should just be a way of building on your proposal for the next 4 years. There's reference to a question from Keith Brown, but I don't see it. I don't see the question. So
I'm trying to find it, but
it's not there. It's not there at 252. I don't see it.
Maybe it's 352.
Maybe. Here we go. Any advice for institutions aspiring to submit applications for centers with different foci? We are trying to strike a balance between using resources efficiently and signaling economics of scale and advantages of collaboration, but want each application to stand alone and be feasible if only some are successful. Okay, so I think Keith is talking about a campus that is proposing multiple centers in different world areas with collaborative activities. Is that right? Do I understand that correctly? So in other words, each request sort of depends on the other. Each application, in a way, sort of depends on other. Is that correct? Am I understanding that right? Yes. Okay. So basically, don't worry about that. Propose whatever you propose, and if all the centers get funded, then it's a non-issue. If one or more doesn't get funded, then we can work that out during the budget negotiation process.
But remember too that when you apply, the reviewers are only going to be reviewing the applications for that world area.
Right.
So if your institution is submitting an application for Africa, Middle East, Russia, South Asia, and Western Europe, well, that's 5 different panels. And the reviewers on the Western Europe panel are not going to be able to read the application from the Africa panel. So each application needs to stand alone and make its argument. And in fact, you could repurpose some language from one application in another one, because the reviewers are separate reviewers in that particular example.
Which actually gives you even more reason not to worry, to just go with what you're doing, because that's right. Each application will be evaluated on its own merits, and we can sort out the details afterwards.
As far as we had a question that I think would be of interest to the whole community about how determinations are made in terms of the world region funding and number of centers funded at what amounts for each world region. Those decisions happen based on a variety of factors, including how many quality applications come in for each world region. So just because we receive fewer applications in a world region doesn't mean necessarily there would be fewer grantees, or there's not necessarily a correlation between number of applications and number of applications funded for a world region. What matters is quality. So if we get, a ton of excellent quality applications in one world region, and then another world region doesn't have as many, then at that point, there are discussions about shifting funding among the world regions. That said, the funding would probably be similar in terms of world region as to what it's been during the past grant cycle. So, so there can be changes by world region, but it's not like, it's not like there would be a massive shift from one world region to another unless something very drastic happened, I think, with higher ups. But I think you can rest assured that these decisions are based on the quality of the applications and the scores. And then at that point, we look at how much money we have and how many centers we can fund.
Another question came in about evaluation. So can you address expectations on the use of recent evaluations to inform the current plan? I think that's a good practice. It's a good practice to use recent evaluations to inform an evaluation plan. It's not necessary, but if you have recent evaluations that can help your readers understand your evaluation plan or that contribute to the explanation of your evaluation plan, you should do it. Also, what about external or internal evaluators for the program? The readers tend to be pretty particular about this, but what they're really looking for is some clarity in terms of whether or not any evaluators that you propose to use are unbiased. So they might be internal to your campus, but and if they are, you should demonstrate that they are unbiased evaluators. And the same thing goes for external. You still have to demonstrate that they're unbiased, that there isn't some conflict of interest there that might imperil the quality of the evaluation.
We have a question that came in about how we determine world region. And the answer there is we don't determine that, you do. You will indicate on the profile form, which will be part of the application package and which you'll complete and upload as part of your application. You will indicate which world region you want to be considered in. So if, Afghanistan might be considered South Asia in one center, and a Middle East center may touch on Afghanistan as well. We aren't determining that. It's how you define your world region of expertise. And the same thing goes for Europe. The Western Europe category can encompass Eastern Europe as well. It can be a Europe center, as some of our current Western Europe grantees are. But if your center's focus is really Eastern Europe and more Russia, then that might be grouped into the Russia and East Europe category. Again, it's your call on the profile form of how you want your application to be considered.
And it's an important point that Carolyn makes. Some Eastern European countries can be included as a Europe center under Western Europe. But if you're doing exclusively Eastern Europe and you're claiming it's Western Europe, the reviewers probably are not going to look kindly on that. They're going to say, well, this is in the wrong world area. Why are they saying Western Europe when every country is in Eastern Europe? So it's okay if there is some overlap. It's okay if you're casting kind of a wider net and calling it Western Europe, but make sure you have some Western Europe in there.
Yeah, what about Puerto Rico? Puerto Rico is not part of this because it's part of the United States. It's a U.S. territory. So Puerto Rico factors into some of our programming because, they have the University of Puerto Rico, which is an MSI, and some of our current NRCs work with them as a partner MSI. But Puerto Rico as a world, a destination, a site in the world is not, we do not consider that as its own, I guess, as part of the world regions. It's obviously part of the Caribbean, and it can be Some of that can be factored into Latin America and Caribbean programming, but that's as a part of a larger discussion of other Caribbean nations or other Latin America, other places in Latin America. So Puerto Rico is a little tricky, but it is technically considered part of the United States. So it's
a domestic flight,
right.
Not an international flight.
Right. Do we have other questions? I know we had a few that came in during the webinar, but just for ease of our Q&A time, if you have other questions, please submit them in the chat right now. And if they are very specific questions, those may be better answered by one of us as a regional program officer. So we have the list of program contacts on the screen.
Can I ask one on behalf of a questioner that appeared earlier, which is, can an applicant request to give only undergraduate FLASs?
Yes, I think that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes,
That can be done.
it can be done and has been done.
It has been done. That's right.
Where should subcontracts be listed in the application? I believe in the budget, I think is the question. I believe that might be under the other category, but
It would be other, yeah.
yeah.
I would say other.
It's other. It's
Under
other.
subcontract.
And then we have a question about, should CVs or bios represent all of your affiliates or only those working on your grant? Tim, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it's your call, but typically it makes sense to focus the CVs on those people who will be contributing to the grant, not necessarily all affiliates. But I mean, you can do it. You can do all affiliates, but it's essential that you get CVs for the people who are going to be principally involved in the grant. That's essential because the reviewers need to be able to check qualifications and ensure that they have the right qualifications to be involved in the grant in the way that they are.
We have a question about, some areas straddling regions as formally defined. Again, we leave it to you to decide which world region you would like to be put in which world regions bucket for the purposes of the review. If your center is doing something topical and not, like, let's say you're talking about climate change across all world regions, and that's your whole center's focus, that would fall under the international category. Those are for centers that are doing work that really spans the globe and cannot be confined to one particular world region. If, on the other hand, your focus is kind of Russia and Middle East, and that inner Asia area, then you need to decide, where does it make sense to be considered? And if you need guidance on that, feel free to reach out to us. And of course, when we receive these applications, we also take the time to look at them, and we won't automatically just put you in the bucket that you've selected if we see that your application actually doesn't belong in that bucket. We will move it as appropriate, but we really ask you to consider where you'd like to be grouped in regionally, and like I said, reach out to us if you need further guidance, and more details would be helpful.
That's a really important point, by the way. That's why we're here. That's us doing our jobs. If you have questions, just reach out to us, ask us. We're here, we're happy to help, and we want to put you in a position to succeed. So any questions you have, we'll answer to the best of our ability. There are some things we can't always answer because we don't know yet, especially when it comes to policy things. But in general, reach out to us, ask us. We're here to help.
And as Tim mentioned, earlier, we don't score these applications. We are there as part of the review process just to make sure everything is going according to plan and everyone's following the same rules. But it's okay for you to ask us a question, that you might not want a reviewer to know that you asked that question. We're not going to share that information with the reviewer. That wouldn't be appropriate, and that's not our role. So now is the time to ask us questions if you have them, and we will do our best to give you the advice that is appropriate. And as I mentioned, we are recording this. We will post the recording on our YouTube channel, and we will post the slides on our website. So make sure to keep an eye on the web pages for National Resource Centers and Foreign Language Centers under the applicant info page. That's where this content will be posted. And keep in touch with us through these various channels that are on this slide. And that way you can get the news when the application is released and the webinar, goes up on YouTube.
So Carolyn, the webinar will go up on YouTube. And what about the PowerPoint?
Yeah, the PowerPoint slides will be posted on the website.
Okay.
And I'll be able to link the slides on the YouTube description once they're on the website.
Okay, so. Excellent. Thanks.
Yeah, academic year FLAS for only graduate students, that's also okay and has been done.
In fact, until about 2010, I think, or maybe 2008, FLAS was only for graduate students. So it's okay to do that.
The order of content on the NIAs, we don't have the official NIA yet. The order of selection criteria is what I think you probably mean. And Brian provided that order earlier in the webinar. And that you can review that on the slide deck when we post it online.
So I really want to take this opportunity to thank the amazing Advanced Training and Research Division team for presenting this webinar this afternoon. And thank you for all your questions and tuning in, and good luck with the application process.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Stay well. Good luck.
Everyone, good luck.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.